All right. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Dantel Proctor from the National Student Attendance, Engagement, and Success Center. Welcome to today's webinar. First, I would like to share with you some brief details about today's webinar. Our presenter is Dr. Bob Belfance from the National Student Attendance, Engagement, and Success Center. Dr. Belfance is a research professor at the Center for the Social Organization of Schools at Johns Hopkins University School of Education, where he is the co-director of the Talent Development Secondary Reform Model and director of the Everyone Graduates Center. He focuses on translating research findings into effective school interventions. In 2013, Dr. Belfance was named a champion for change for African American education by the White House. Today's webinar will last for approximately 60 minutes with time for questions. We will be placing everyone on mute. Please do not unmute yourself, but instead refer to the chat function on the right side of the screen if you have a question. Please feel free to log your questions as the presenters are talking, and we will leave some time at the end to answer them. If we do not have enough time to get through all of the questions, we will reply to all participants by email within the next 5 to 7 days. We encourage you to ask questions or simply share a comment. Today's webinar is one of a number being offered by the Technical Assistance Center during 2017. The center is new. It is funded by the Department of Education, specifically the Office of Safe and Healthy Students. Our website is currently being developed, and we're hoping to have it up and running as soon as possible. Before I hand over to Dr. Belfance, I wanted to share with you the mission of our center. The mission of the center is to disseminate evidence-based practices and build and facilitate communities of practice to help students attend every day, be engaged in school, and succeed academically so that they graduate high school prepared for college, career, and civic life. I will pass it off to you now, Dr. Belfance.
Thank you. Good afternoon, everybody. We're going to spend some time together thinking about the methods for identifying the root causes of chronic absenteeism. And our goal here really is to, in order to get our kids in school every day, we have to understand why they're not coming. And that's the idea of what's underneath the reasons they may be giving that's really driving it. Because if we can solve it at the root causes, we can impact lots of kids with our solutions as opposed to having to solve every individual kid. We can't individually intervene our way out of the problem. So if we go to the next slide. So our goals are to gain knowledge and capacity to identify the causes impacting attendance from the beginning and throughout the school year, and working together to reduce chronic absenteeism through data-driven approaches. And the reason we're doing this is really strongly said by our principal here that says, if we really want our schools to move, we have to make sure our students are there to benefit from all the hard work we're doing, and we have to then do the hard work to get them in that door. So just to level set for folks, because I know some of you are deeply into this issue and some of you might be new to it, when we say chronic absenteeism, what do we mean? And this is really a sea change in thinking about absenteeism. Because traditionally we thought about things like truancy, which is sort of a legal definition for missing a certain number of unexcused days of school in either total number or a certain number in a row, or average daily attendance, which is how many kids are in the seats on an average day. But what really matters is how many days of school each kid gets, and are they there consistently to benefit from all the good teaching and learning going on. So chronic absenteeism counts excused absences and unexcused absences and suspensions. It's really a tally of the total days of school missed for any reason, and then saying if more than 10% of all days, we call that chronically absent. If you're missing 10% or more of school, data tells us that's going to have lots of negative impacts on student outcomes. So we really have to rally and try to make sure none of our kids miss 10% or more of school for any reason, and at the same time drive up the number of kids who are really good attenders and coming every day. It wasn't until last June that we actually had a first national census of how many kids were chronically absent, and it was a pretty stunning result showing that it was millions of kids, about 12% of all kids, but this had great local variety. In some locales, it's 30% of kids are missing 10% or more of school. And in other locales, it's a smaller number. And one of the key findings from this data is that chronic absenteeism is widespread and highly concentrated. So if we look at the first quarter, we divide all our school districts into 4 equal quarters. We find that in one quarter, which is 86% of all districts, that's where we can find 1/4 of the chronically absent kids. All the way to the other extreme, in 1% of districts, we can find another 1/4 of kids, which tells us there's chronically absent kids everywhere, but they're highly concentrated in a subset of locales as well. All right, let's get into our root causes. So there's really 4 broad buckets of reasons why kids don't come to school. And in our hunt for root causes, we're sort of trying to toggle between these to see which is the one that sort of matches up with the particular circumstances we're examining. So some of these are myths, and we're going to examine those in detail in a minute. It's really people not thinking that either they are chronically absent when they are, or that it doesn't really matter if you miss a day here or a day there, or it only matters in certain grades if you attend regularly. Then there are barriers, things that are preventing kids from getting to school on a regular basis that happen outside of school. Lack of access to health or dental care, chronic illness, poor transportation, safety issues, being homeless. There's also a group of reasons where kids are avoiding something in school. They're struggling academically or socially, they're being bullied, the school is not a nice place to be, they're feeling excluded or pushed out, or their parents had a negative school experience and don't really stress the need to be there every day because they just did their best to endure what they thought was a tough situation. Or they may have an undiagnosed disability of one nature or another that's making it hard for them to get to school every day. And then after a period of time, those struggles through aversions or barriers or just getting caught up in the myths and suddenly finding yourself well behind, kids get disengaged, and then and they don't have a strong relationships with adults in school. They're more susceptible to sort of peer effects of, hey, let's take the day off and do something fun together. You can start to sometimes get a contagion effect, or often kids will say that I'm on a 4-day plan. I can succeed in school 4 days out of 5. The 5th day is sort of my day for all sorts of good or bad reasons in my life, and they often find it doesn't work. They're pretty bad arbitragers of how often they need to be in school to succeed, but they think they can pull it off. So we're going to go deep now into 2 of these, and the first one is this idea of myths. This attitude that, it's only consecutive absences that are a problem. If I miss 6 or 7 days in a row, that's a problem, but if I miss a day here or a day there, no big deal. Or that parents may think it's only in the upper grades that it really matters, and it's okay in K and first grade to sort of get them there when you can. Or that it's only a problem if it's excused. If I have a good reason not to be there, it shouldn't be a problem. Or if I think I have a good reason. And where this really comes home is when they've done close studies of how well do parents know what their students' chronic absenteeism rates are. They basically find that parents underestimate the number of absent days their kids have been absent. Often by as much as 50%, they're below, thinking that their kids are going more often than they are, and therefore they're not really responding to it, and they don't know that it's adding up. This day here or day here is suddenly adding up to 20 days or a full month of school by the end of the year. And schools sort of do some things sometimes to build on these myths, sort of very impersonal letters that sort of clearly are bureaucratic, and you get a sense that the school can't put really energy into saying they miss my kid, must mean it doesn't really matter that much. Interestingly, one is that some people have found and argued that sending makeup packets home without a discussion of why the kid is missing school can be counterproductive. It's sort of signaling, it's okay to miss a day here, a day there. We'll give you makeup work. You do the makeup work, you're fine. Didn't really need to be in school that day as long as you do this work packet. And when there's lots of kids absent or lots of teacher absenteeism, it sends a signal that sort of it's okay to take a day here, a day there. So these myths can both be done from lack of solid knowledge of what the story is and how much school has been missed, and then a lack of a really serious and supportive response from a school can send signals that everyone's okay with missing those few days here or there. So that's the myths bucket of our root cause, and that's one we can see where we can sort of address in a pretty systematic way, as sort of a good prevention strategy. People have found that if you just do a letter in a different way, it can be very powerful, but if you give parents sort of just clean information of how many days their kids have missed so far, how close they are to being chronically absent, what the consequences of chronic absenteeism are, you write it in sort of a friendly tone. We love having your student in school. We want them here every day. We miss them when they're not. We want to let you know where things stand. There's ways we can help you. If you need some help, give us a call. That type of letter has been shown to actually increase attendance by 2 to 3%, as opposed to the more formal bureaucratic letters, which have often been seen as basically ignored and basically almost saying it's okay to miss a day here or a day there. So that's one thing we can do about the myths, and the other thing we can do is really just good parental information about that regular school attendance really matters. And a day here and a day here is actually really not a good idea, and those days add up, and give them good information so they know year to date how their kids are doing. And as we can see from this U-shaped curve, we have to do this early on, both the pre-K, kindergarten, we have high rates of chronic absenteeism, and then again, with that transition to the middle grades, we're going to have to hit it again, and then the transition to high school, hit it again. We can't just assume because we made this message clear to parents when kids were young, or we wait till they're older, it's enough. We have to get that good, strong messaging out at all those key transition years, entry into elementary school, entry into middle school, entry into high school. We can know up front we're going to have kids, some kids are chronically absent, and we should have good upfront prevention to make sure none of them walk in carrying or reacting to the sort of myth that it doesn't matter. Another way to help us really uncover root causes is to look for those geographic patterns, both locally within a district and more broadly across states. And so one of the things we did with that new data that came out is we mapped it nationally and really identified those 4% of districts and 12% of schools where half our chronically absent kids are found. And that in itself revealed an interesting pattern that helps us get to some of these root causes. Because there was two very different types of districts in that 4%. Some of them were relatively affluent and large school districts, typically suburban school districts, that were really shocked to see that they were on this list of places with the greatest number and highest concentration of chronically absent kids. But if you have a school district of 150,000 and you even have a 10% chronic absenteeism rate, a few points below the national average, that's 15,000 kids a year in your district that are chronically absent. So that ends up being a lot of kids, even though the percent might not seem that big compared to other places. And that was really a wake-up call to a lot of these districts that they didn't think they had an attendance problem. They weren't paying any attention to it. They weren't looking at chronic absenteeism. And there they had 15,000 kids a year missing a month or more of school. So that just helped them, pay attention to it. And then they were sort of well positioned because they often are more resource districts to do something about it. The other group of schools in that group, in that 4% of districts, 12% of schools, were places of really high and concentrated poverty. And they had very high rates. Sometimes as high as 50%, right? There are some high poverty districts where half the kids in the district are chronically absent. And that leads to a different type of root cause, right? Until we can have mechanisms to help address that concentrated poverty, it's going to be tough to really drive that number down to something very low. And we found the same thing that rural areas, although they have fewer kids because they're smaller, were actually places where they had high concentrations. And most of the places that had 30% or more chronically absent kids ended up being rural districts. And again, this helps us understand when we look at these patterns, that we tend to get a different picture than we might imagine. It's not just an urban issue, not just an urban high poverty issue. It's rural areas with poverty, in particular, also have really high rates of chronic absenteeism, though maybe a smaller number of kids overall. And that can be sort of get lost if you just focus on the districts that have the greatest number and don't also look at the places with the highest percent. And that's why it's important to look both ways when you're looking for your geographic patterns to get a deeper sense of what some of the underlying root causes might be. So now we're going to go deeper into this idea of concentrated poverty itself as a root cause of chronic absenteeism. And what people have shown through recent lived experience, for those that have had to struggle through it, is that poverty is both an individual and family experience and a group neighborhood experience. At the individual level, family level, it means not having enough money to provide the basics: food, shelter, clothing, heat, medicine, or to live in a safe and healthy environment. At the group neighborhood level, it means you're living in areas where many other people are poor as well, and you're impacted by their poverty as well as your own. So Concentrated poverty then are places where starting at 20% and going up to 40% of the people in that neighborhood themselves are poor. That's when there's strong evidence of this idea of a double burden, that you're impacted by your own poverty and the poverty of folks around you. And this chart, again, just shows you how this is the idea of poverty versus low income, how they're distributed across different social groups and ethnic groups in our nation, right? And how that whether it's low income or poverty, there's some differences in how people are experiencing those two situations. So this idea of being low income or poor in a high poverty neighborhood that creates this double burden. Your poverty and the poverty of those around you. And that's usually higher crime rates, leads to poorer housing conditions, fewer jobs, limited access to healthy food. That's not just because you yourself is poor, that's because many people in your neighborhood around you are poor. So you have both those impacts. Living in neighborhoods of concentrated poverty increased dramatically through the recession, nearly doubling from about 6 million to almost 12 million folks. And when we map again this growth, we see that it was very unevenly felt across states and regions. So this is what it looks like in 2000. Deeper blue means higher percent of people living in poverty in that county. Bright yellow means relatively few. We can see in 2000, this looks like the historical pattern of poverty in America. You can clearly see Appalachia. You can see the arc through the South. You can see the Southwest. You can see Native American areas in the upper Northwest and Midwest. In 2010, at the height of the recession, I'm going to go back and forth here for you, right? You can see it spreads out everywhere. Look how Michigan changes, for example, from largely yellow to considerably blue, right? That was the big change brought on by the recession that we're still working our way out of in many of these areas. Interestingly enough, if you can see, the one area that stayed yellow was Washington, D.C., where all the federal policymakers are. They had less direct experience with that change during that period. So the growth of neighborhood poverty over the past decade suggests the scale and intensity of student needs is likely increased in the schools that serve those areas. This again is getting back to our root causes of chronic absenteeism and how you get that pattern of a relatively small number of places having high concentrations maps pretty strongly onto the areas that have experienced this growth in concentrated poverty over the past decade. Why this matters is some good research done out of California is when you get to that really high poverty level in a school, over 75%, from mixed, which is around 50% or less, you get this huge jump in the number of kids in a classroom that have high needs from out of school, which each one of these things, hunger, housing, medical care, dental care, caregiving for family members, economic stress, immigration, violence, safety, all of those are drivers of absenteeism. So we can see that this gets much more impacted when we really get to that high level of poverty, and it puts much more stress on the schools in that situation. One end result is we see higher rates of chronic absenteeism here. This was directly demonstrated in New York City by some really nice research done that showed that more than 1/3 of the children chronically absent for 5 years in a row were in a subset of schools, right? Think about it, you're chronically absent 5 years in a row in elementary school, right? Something seriously going on outside of school. And this was deeply correlated with homelessness, child abuse, male unemployment, and low levels of parental education. And they actually found that chronic absenteeism ended up being a better index of poverty than traditional measures of free and reduced price lunch. Again, because we can see concentrated poverty, the things you experience are the very things that make it harder to get to school every day. Another reason why this matters is that attendance is vital for everybody, but it's particularly vital for kids that live in poverty, because that's the place they have the greatest opportunity to learn. So some data from Connecticut showing that it's the kids that are eligible for free lunch that really get hit hard in terms of graduation when they have high rates of chronic absenteeism. It impacts everybody, but you can see the impact is almost doubled when you are living in poverty as opposed to when you're not. And that's partly has to do with just fewer resources outside of school to make up for what you were learning in school when you weren't there when you live in poverty versus when you don't. So this is our point that root causes of chronic absenteeism, one root cause, not the only one, is living in a neighborhood of concentrated poverty. And when we think about our solutions, it's both individually working with those kids, but thinking more systematically how schools and communities can work to attack some of those underlying issues of housing and health and transportation and exposure to violence, which are driving large numbers of kids not to be able to attend school on a regular basis. So we're not saying schools have to solve everything, and they need lots of community partners to be able to take this on, but they can be a nexus of action for this work. And we've seen this time and time again, that if we bring communities into schools, we can help build up some of the capacity necessary to address some of those driving barriers, root causes of chronic absenteeism. Because again, especially in these high poverty neighborhoods, the school is often one of the few functioning institutions in that neighborhood, which makes it even a stronger case for being that we have to sort of build a lot of our other supports around the school itself. So here's a sort of complex diagram that again just speaks to this idea of all these factors and how they sort of come together to impact the school, but how we can then sort of here really start building to our solutions, right? Which is, if we take this approach where we first have actionable data, where we're getting good weekly runs on who's chronically absent, who's trending towards it, who hasn't been chronically absent but is becoming, because that's often a golden hour, because it means something likely has just happened, because before they were able to attend regularly and now they're not. And it's often easier to address something that's just happened than something that's been going on for years, and a lot of sort of dysfunctional responses have been built around it. We have to do capacity building of the school and the community around it to be able to address this data and build these strategic partnerships with the health agencies, with the housing agencies, with the community partners who can serve as success mentors. So when we identify these barriers, we have those partners at the table with us to help be problem solvers, and not just like, well, maybe we should go talk to the health department. Who do we talk to? We don't really know. We don't really have a time to build a relationship, so I guess we'll just have to let that go. So building these strategic partnerships on the front end is really important, because you can see if you live in an area of poverty, you're going to need them to address those root causes. You want to have some shared accountability. In New York City, for example, the Mayor's Interagency Task Force on Chronic Absenteeism worked with the homeless family shelters and actually finally for the first time got them data so they would know which of their kids were chronically absent and can work to get them to the right school. But in so doing, then the housing authority takes on some responsibility and some shared accountability about, are your kids getting to school when they're under your care and support. And again, really driving home this positive engagement. We really have to see this as like we're in this together. We know there's a lot of factors that make it hard to get your kid to school every day. We're not here to sort of say you're a bad parent. We're here to really try to figure out how we can help you overcome those barriers so your kid can be and really benefit from really continual and ongoing school attendance. And again, just being sort of stating the obvious that there's no one-size-fits-all approach to this, but it really is this idea of having a set of resources combined with a sense of empathy and urgency, and a clear sense of possibility that allows us to sort of start pushing back against these root causes of chronic absenteeism. And now we're pulling on some examples that were shared in our recent national virtual convening and pulled together by our friends at Attendance Works to again show you how actual states and districts are doing this work on the ground. This comes from our friends, the Oakland Unified School District, and they've really established a multi-tiered and multifaceted approach to trying to push back against some of those root causes of chronic absenteeism. And they've, started building some toolkits, which you can, sort of access from this link here, or just typing it in yourself. And as you can see, they built that those partnerships with the housing authority, dating, sharing, and partnering in schools, building up parent ambassadors and stuff, and saying that part of your job is to get your kids to school. And here's some ways you can help. Bringing after-school providers in. That's a very powerful strategy. Most schools have some sort of after-school providers often they're just co-located in the building. We need to go beyond that and make them active partners in helping get our kids to school every day, because they bring a sense of person power, often a space to build those relationships with the kids, to understand root causes, because once the student is chronically absent, especially in an ongoing way over multiple years, we're either going to have to solve a problem or change a behavior, and it's really hard to do that if we don't have a positive relationship with that student and that family. After-school spaces are really good at building those positive relationships, and we need to bring them into the game to leverage those to help get a deeper understanding of the root causes of why kids aren't coming, and use that as a springboard to sort of help solve those issues. Again, they're moving on many fronts. Here they're sort of moving on many of those myth fronts about educating parents about the importance, creating good positive environments where kids want to be, not having it be that, I'll get myself to school, but it's not really a good place to be, so after a while, I'm not going to keep pushing through the rain to get there. So helping create the schools where kids want to be. Here's some really good advice, again, at the site level, sort of a different way of thinking what we just talked about, bring from the engaging parents to recognizing good and improved attendance. It often can just be social recognition goes a long way, even all the way through high school. Doesn't have to be stuff, and stuff doesn't always work that well over a long time, but just that recognition for improvement and continually having good attendance and class improvement, grade improvement, lots of ways to sort of use social recognitions to motivate kids to push by some of those factors that they might otherwise get in their way of coming to school. Really needing that personalized early outreach. Once someone's trending towards chronic absenteeism, someone who has a relationship with them has got to start talking with them, trying to understand what's going on. Maybe they just had bronchitis, that's fine. Make sure that they can help catch up, and it's not an ongoing thing, but maybe something has happened recently. Maybe they've started doing sibling care for a sibling or elder care for a great aunt that helped raise them. And if we don't give them a better way to do that, they're going to start missing lots of schools for lots of years. So that's only that personalized outreach lets you get there. And then really just, you've got to really keep monitoring your attendance as a just regular practice. And then, as we said, when you find those big barriers, develop programmatic responses to them. Find ways to overcome the safety factor in getting to school. Or if there's a certain health issue that's paramount, partner with that health provider to help do some prevention and screening. From school level, folks doing the work. Again, from our friends at attendance work and our recent natural virtual convening. Here again, they have built this middle school of the arts has built up an attendance team and doing everything from the weekly meetings to review the data, the teachers having parental contact, to having those social recognitions, the student tardy, and parental contracts, the students we miss you postcards, again, creating that thing that we want you here. Again, sort of creating a multifaceted approach to sort of building up the connective tissues to sort of address some of those root causes. Again, the shift from sort of supportive and therapeutic from punitive, and trying to be proactive and stressing the positive. And finally, we're going to start with our friends at Connecticut to show a statewide response and showing how over time we've had some pretty good impacts on pushing that number down, even though obviously there's work yet to be done. They've sort of codified it into 6 high-impact strategies that, again, are different ways of saying we've already said, is that you have to understand you have an issue and it's something to rally around. You've got to have that data so you know where to act and what to act on. You've got to have your champions that believe in the work. You've got to build some capacity. You have to highlight the folks that are making a difference so folks can believe it can be done, and then build a sense that we're all in this together and we all have a role to play. And it's in many ways just showing how it's sort of enacted some of those models we showed earlier, that it's actually being put in practice. They have those outside of the schoolhouse partnerships with healthcare centers and social service agencies and museums and arts and cultural and faith communities. They're doing that positive campaigning and awareness to make sure that people don't buy the myth that, missing a day here or there is okay, or that my kid only missed a couple days, they're not really chronically absent, along with those inside the schoolhouse activities and a continual data review. And really, this just being how we, bring it all together. There's a role that we played at the district, school, and a community level. And this is a California example, again, of how they sort of think across those levels with different types of supports at different levels and at different levels of need. So before the upcoming webinars, I just want to, sort of summarize what we said. Is that, root causes of chronic absenteeism can really run the gamut from believing in some myths to avoiding things at school, to having things outside of school pull you away from school, to becoming disengaged from school and not thinking it matters. Why it really makes it matters to understand the root cause and not just say, hey, you missed a day of school, like don't do it again, or here's some incentives to come every day. It doesn't really matter why you don't come as long as you start reacting to these incentives, is that if we get our analysis wrong, our interventions can actually sometimes make it worse, not better. Oftentimes, for example, people try a tough love approach. There's times when that's appropriate. You were doing so great. You're a really good student. And then I just noticed recently, like you just haven't been here. Like what's going on? You've got to get your act together. Like you can't do that. You've got to be here every day. It's on you. You can't just sort of slack off like that. You could do so much more. Take a case that's nothing inappropriate about that. Maybe it's an appropriate response. However, if what's recently changed in that student's life is that they're now staying home to give the great aunt who raised them a diabetes shot because they feel they're the only member of their family who can do that with the regularity needed for it to work and their aunt not to get sick, they're not going to react too kindly to that tough love advice. They're going to think like, wow, I'm sort of being heroic and you're coming down on me. Like I'm going to pull away from you. I'm not going to lean in and listen to what you say. And that's why it really matters to have that relationship, so that before you sort of launch into your theory of action about what's going on, you have a discussion with a kid and you've built up enough trust that you might have a shot at getting the real answers, because then that's going to really help you understand the root cause and address it better. And that's the individual level. And then at the group level, we've got to be aggregating up all that we're finding. So when we find a thing that any number of kids are saying, hey, I'm missing because if I come in late, I get yelled at and I get in trouble and I have to go to detention. And the reason I'm late is because they've changed the bus routes. And if you're not there at a certain time and the time sort of changes, it's never quite exactly the same time, and you miss that bus, there's not another bus that comes by for 35 minutes. And I'm guaranteed to be late and guaranteed to be in trouble. And on those days, it's better just to stay home and say I'm sick than to go and get yelled at, because it wasn't really my fault that like the bus comes at different times, and then if you miss it, it doesn't come again, right? So if any number of kids are telling you that, you've got to start moving and start calling up and working with the transportation system to help figure out, is there a way we can get a more regular schedule or a better backup, so it's just not one shot at making it work that's a little bit beyond the student's control to control. So that's just sort of giving you some examples of why identifying root causes are important. So as we can see, we have too many of our kids missing too much school, and often the kids who need it the most are the ones that are missing it the most. So we have to really organize against it. But if we don't do the work to understand the root causes, we might not get the impacts we want. That might lead to some frustrations. We might give up too early. So hopefully we gave some helpful advice today about how to think about those root causes. We went deep on myths and concentrated poverty. We could have gone deep on aversion to school or other factors keeping you out of school or disengagement. That will be covered in some of our forthcoming webinars, which you can see here, as well as some links to where you can get some great information about the work being done by our new center, the National Student Attendance, Engagement, and Success Center, supported and sponsored by the U.S. Department of Education. So the views here today are my own. So with that, I think we can open it up to some questions.
So Bob, we don't have any questions logged in the chat function.
Okay. Oh yeah, here's our contact number if you want to follow up directly to ask your question. So with that, I think we'll call it an afternoon, and I thank everybody for joining us, and visit us again. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone, for attending today. We hope that you found it helpful and informative. And keep an eye out for our website, which will be up shortly.